Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So the Liberal Party didn't do very well in the last election, frankly, provincially. Frankly, it didn't do very well in the last two elections. And Andrew Perez, who is a Toronto-based public affairs professional, freelance writer, and political activist, wrote a really fascinating article that I read on TVO's website about what the Liberal Party needs to do. And I thought it was really quite interesting and something that we should really talk through and address, because I think a lot of the suggestions are very, very accurate. And so I wanted to bring Andrew on the show tonight. Let me tell you a little bit more about Andrew. He volunteered on the Ontario Liberal Party's 2022 Central Campaign as a communications advisor. He has got quite an extensive background in politics and in communications. He's a political junkie and a historian. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian, for having me.
So you've been involved in politics for quite a while.
Yeah, so by way of background, I guess my first election was the 2004 federal election. I was 18 years old in grade 12. That was a seminal election for me because I had decided around that time to join the federal Liberal Party and become active. I was also selected as a House of Commons page in my first year of university at Carleton University. So that election took place just May and June of 2004, and I was heading to Ottawa in the fall to attend university and work as a page. So, first minority parliament in 25 years that was elected in that election, and then went on to become involved in both the federal and provincial parties, I guess, over the last 18 years now. And then I would say I've lived in Toronto since 2010 and have been quite active in the Ontario Liberal Party. I worked briefly in the Wynne government as a staffer. When former Premier McGuinty resigned in 2012, I played an active volunteer role on the Sandra Pupatello leadership campaign. And so there's, and maybe we'll get into this later, but there's some things I learned even as far back as 10 years ago about the party. That concerned me then, that I think a lot of those fears have come to fruition in terms of, when I volunteered on Sandra's leadership campaign back in 2012, early 2013, I heard from voters in rural Ontario that they felt that they had been left behind by the OLP. And that was just as the party was starting to lose momentum. You'll recall in 2011, McGuinty was reduced to a minority government and lost the lion's share of seats that he'd held in rural Ontario. So that began kind of a gradual slide. And then in 2014, I was actually involved on that campaign. I worked on the central campaign team. I was pretty junior at that time, but was a staffer in the government. And we defied the odds and formed a majority government. But we did so by virtually sweeping the GTA and Ottawa regions, picked up a smattering of other seats, one seat in London, one seat in Kingston, a couple seats in the north, but otherwise, our majority was built on urban centers. And so I say in the piece that that strategy might work from time to time, but it's incredibly risky because once you find yourself in government, you don't have representation in large swaths of the province. So that's kind of been my experience. But I've worked on federal and provincial campaigns, and as someone who's kind of been part of the central campaign, but also knocked on doors and been at the ground level, I do think that I have somewhat of a unique perspective.
Well, I thought it was an extremely well-written article. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back right after those 2 minutes of messages with Andrew to talk a little bit more about what he thinks is wrong right now with the Liberal Party in Ontario, why it lost the last election, and what it can do about it. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Andrew Perez, who is a political activist within the Ontario Liberal Party, federal Liberal Party as well, worked on the central campaign as a volunteer in the communications area. And he wrote a really argumentative, interesting, provocative piece in TVO about what went wrong in the Liberal Party campaign and what the Liberal Party needs to do to win back support in Ontario. And I really wanted to chat with Andrew about it. Andrew, it's interesting in the last campaign, Stephen Del Duca won the same number of votes in absolute numbers as we did as the Liberals did in the prior campaign. And the only reason why the percentage went up from a popular vote was because the absolute turnout for everyone else in the province went down. So the performance, while from a percentage standpoint was more attractive, the seat count and the absolute number of voters was equal to the worst performance almost in Ontario Liberal Party history since the 1940s. What do you think was the cause of that?
Well, I think that's the $1 million question. And what I try to get across in my piece is that it's a multitude of factors that I believe have been brewing for about a decade now. And so, to pin the result on the leader or the platform solely, I think is a mistake. I think, as I said in the intro, we lost rural Ontario between 2011 and 2014 for a variety of reasons: green energy policies, other factors, a perception that the government was, governing with a GTA lens, so to speak, on policy. And also a perception that, I think this goes to Liberal parties broadly speaking across the country, that perhaps we're seen as more elite, the party of the white collar worker. And so I think that's really hurt us in large swaths of the province. I'm born and raised in London, Ontario. Now, I've lived in Toronto for 12 years, but my parents reside in London. I return there regularly to visit family and friends. And so I do get that sense when I speak to people there. I mean, it's merely anecdotal, but if you look at a city like London, which the London area has about 500 or 600,000 people, it's a major Ontario city. We've now, and you referenced, the number of votes were equal in the last two elections. We've now, in two consecutive elections, come a distant fourth in all four London ridings, and that was unheard of. Even 10 years ago, this was a bastion for the party. Even when the Progressive Conservatives were in power for 42 straight years, Southwestern Ontario was a Liberal stronghold. Not to mention, when McGuinty was in power, we swept the city and had major cabinet ministers like Deb Matthews and Chris Bentley in cabinet representing London. So to now have a situation where, I revisited the election returns in my hometown. A riding like London West, we received 12% of the vote to the NDP's 45%. The NDP is the incumbent there. And so that's just, that's an unmitigated disaster. I don't know how else to describe it. And so we need to rebuild the party at the riding association level in every region of the province, because when I actually look at the election returns in the GTA, I'm actually quite hopeful. In almost a dozen ridings, we came a mere few hundred votes from winning. And then most of the other ridings, we were a relatively competitive second. So I do think if we make the right decisions and we have a competitive leadership race and we rebuild, we will eventually come back in the Greater Toronto area and Toronto proper. But what I worry more about is the infrastructure, and where will our party even continue to be a credible party in Southwestern Ontario and parts of Eastern Ontario, Northern Ontario, and that goes to our goal should be to form a majority government that represents every region, and we can't do that if we're only relevant in major urban centers, and let alone London is a major urban center, and yet we're not relevant there.
Why have the NDP done so well in London? That doesn't seem to me to be a socialist town.
No, and I have fairly deep family roots there on my mother's side of the family. So that is puzzling. I think the city has changed over the past 10, 15 years. I think the 2008, 2009 global recession had a major impact on Southwest Ontario, and London was certainly impacted. The hollowing out of the manufacturing sector, those were well-paid middle to upper middle income jobs. And so I think that had an impact on the city. And I think, I don't know for certain, but my sense is that that Londoners and southwestern Ontarians across southwestern Ontario became so disengaged with the Ontario Liberal Party. A lot of them probably moved to the NDP, more in the urban centers, London, Windsor. I mean, Windsor has long been a New Democratic stronghold, but it was held by Sandra Pupatello and Dwight Duncan for several terms. So my sense is that a lot of those voters that were supporting the OLP in places like London and Windsor and Brantford and Chatham have moved to the NDP, and then of course those regions naturally have always been good for the Conservatives. So the OLP has kind of been squeezed out, and so that really concerns me. I mean, even right now, to be fair, in the Doug Ford cabinet, there's only, to my knowledge, a single minister from southwestern Ontario, which is Monty McNaughton, who represents a riding just outside London that is overwhelmingly rural. So even in Doug Ford's cabinet, now he did appoint a minister from Windsor, to be fair, but I think that's a region that needs meaty cabinet representation. It's a region that really spans from Kitchener-Waterloo all the way to Windsor. And it's actually incidentally not represented in the federal cabinet at all right now.
Yeah, and so the issue that you're talking about, is it just an Ontario Liberal Party problem, or is it the same problem that the federal Liberals have? The federal Liberals aren't that representative in Southwestern Ontario either, are they?
So it is a similar problem. However, my diagnosis would be that it's far more dire for the provincial party. Federally, in London, 2 of the seats are held by the Liberals and have been held by the Liberals since 2015. And so we're still able to win seats in the city of London proper. Now, outside London, we're not competitive, and so that is a similar problem. But for some reason, the provincial party has its brand, its reputation has been far more impacted than the federal party.
And you don't think that was a leader issue? That was a more structural issue?
Provincially, yeah. So is it a leader issue? Well, as you say, we received our all-time lowest vote share in 2 consecutive elections with different leaders. I would say that Wynne and Del Duca are very different people, and so yet we receive the same result. Now, they both do come from Toronto GTA, but no, I think it's far greater than the leader. Now, as you saw, I suggest in my piece that we look at selecting a leader that's not from the GTA. And I think that suggestion for some is controversial, because people will say, well, it ought not matter where a leader comes from. I'm looking for, what's their platform? What's their value proposition? Do they resonate? And that's all true, but I think to some extent it does matter where a leader comes from, because you are shaped by where you come from. And if we have a reputation as being a big city party that's left rural and smaller town Ontario behind, then how is that going to look if our next leader hails from downtown Toronto, for example? So I think we need to look at finding a leader from a different region that has roots in that region, and can bring in not only new voters to the party, but voters who used to support our party but have drifted away over the past 10 years, and likely park their vote either with the PCs or the NDP.
Now, I interviewed a candidate from London in the last election. She ran for leader of the provincial party 2 years ago. Professor in political science, very involved in the local municipality. Said that she had knocked on thousands of doors for upwards of a year. That's the kind of candidate that you would have thought would have been successful, and if successful, could have been that leader that was not from Toronto that you're talking about. But she didn't win.
It's a great example. I know Kate Graham. I think she was a terrific candidate. She ran twice. She also ran for the leadership, as you noted. And I think that's actually the best example of why we're in trouble. Because if a outstanding candidate like Kate Graham wasn't able to win, let alone she did come in third for the second time, I don't think that's a commentary on the quality of her candidacy. She did do the best out of all the London area candidates. She came, I think that's a commentary on, to your point, some of the structural problems that we face as a party. Our brand, and I get into my piece around lurching more to the left. That's certainly the perception. Brand conflation, and this is an issue at the federal level because the party has moved to the left. I mean, people will say, well, they run on the left, but they don't necessarily govern on the left. Well, I think the party has both substantively in terms of platform, but also governing moved to the left. And there's a bit of brand conflation when ordinary people think of, well, who am I going to vote for? I think a lot of people, and I've had these discussions with people in places like London, have trouble differentiating between what the NDP and the Liberals represent. And so I think that becomes a challenge. I think the center of Ontario politics is still a fertile ground. And that's where Doug Ford won his second majority, where he was able to actually form a larger majority.
Isn't that part of the problem, is that a lot of people thought Doug Ford was going to be very right-wing, particularly when he first ran, and maybe even that first year when Justin Trudeau federally ran against Doug Ford and
Yes.
did so successfully. But he actually governed a lot more from the center during the pandemic, and surprised a lot of people in that regard, and didn't leave, therefore, a lot of room for the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party, as you said, both federally and provincially, have moved to the left. That said, I think that a lot of people thought Kathleen Wynne's last budget was a very left-wing budget, frankly, more left-wing than the NDP's platform.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. And so that's the perception, is that we've moved to the left. And as I mentioned in the piece, Doug Ford deserves credit. He turned around what was a disastrous first 2 years in his term, and really took, when COVID hit, was able to pivot and take a pretty nonpartisan approach, whereby he was able to work closely with Trudeau and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland to tackle the pandemic. Now, I've always said he often made the right decision, but a few weeks late. But he often did get around to making the right decision and adhered to the advice that he received from the scientific community. And he thumbed his nose at the anti-vaxxers and in his caucus. He lost
some of them out.
Yeah. And people thought that was crazy, that was his base, and what on earth was he doing? And, Roman Baber is running for the federal leadership, trying to make a point that he stood up to Doug Ford. And all I can do is chuckle and say, yeah, and he got rid of you and came back with a bigger majority. So I think, it's fascinating to me, the tack that Ford has taken when compared to much of the federal party and Pierre Poilievre's
but
leadership.
The federal party and Canada is different than Ontario and the provincial party. There is a significantly greater percentage of more right-wing individuals in the federal party and in Canada. And so therefore it is more fertile ground for Pierre Poilievre and Roman Baber, no?
It is. No, that you make a good point. My concern is I see Ford to some extent, it's 40 years later and the province has changed, but to some degree, I think he's replicating Bill Davis's big blue tent. I'm well aware that only 42% of Ontarians voted, but it looks like many people who parked their vote with Ford in this election, whether they did so reluctantly or not, didn't identify as progressive conservatives. These probably weren't people that were voting for Tim Hudak.
He had unions endorse him. How did he do that?
Yeah. I mean, that's the $1 million question. I think Monty McNaughton played a major role on that file with introducing worker-friendly legislation and trying to really reverse the perception that I think, was built as early as the early 90s when Harris became leader and then governed the province. And certainly when Hudak, under his leadership, what he was proposing and running on only cemented those perceptions. And so somehow they've been able to reverse that. And I think, as I say, a lot of people that probably don't identify with the party voted for the party, whether that was a vote for Doug Ford or he wasn't as bad, to your point, as I thought he would be, and he deserves a second mandate, or they're the better go with the devil, he was still able to garner that support. And so I worry longer term, if the PCs become another brokerage Big Tent party, where does that leave the OLP? And so I think lurching to the left is not the answer, because the NDP own that territory, and we saw in this election that left-leaning voters, many of them opted for Horwath's NDP, and so we need to play. And this is another point I feel strongly about. It's not just about preparing for the 2026 election. It's preparing for the long term. So we need to make decisions today that will benefit our party 10, 15 years from now in terms of what's our value proposition? Who are we? What do we stand for? Because if we just play to the 2026 election, that's fine. But if that doesn't work out, then we're back at the drawing board. So let's build a centrist party that is attractive in every region of the province, because at some point Ford will move on and there'll be a new leader. Maybe that leader will be more of a Tim Hudak style leader, and a lot of the support that Ford's garnered will disappear. That will be fertile ground for the OLP to move into. But if we're seen as a downtown left-wing party, we won't be well positioned. So we need to make those tough decisions now. I want to position us for success in the long term, not merely the next election. The next election is going to be a tough election to win. We will have had no party status for 8 years by that point. So I'm hoping that if there's a silver lining from last month's result, it's that we accept that, the 2018 was not an anomaly, because we basically got the identical result in 2022. So it's time to make some tough decisions, and I'm hopeful that the party will do that, starting with a competitive leadership race.
We're chatting tonight with Andrew Perez, who is a party activist within the Ontario Liberal Party, about what's wrong with the Ontario Liberal Party and what it needs to do to improve its results. He wrote a very fascinating, provocative piece in TVO that I wanted to reach out to him and talk a little bit more about. We're going to take a break, 2 minutes. We're going to be back with Andrew, and I'm going to ask him a little bit about some of the lessons from the past of what has made the Ontario Liberal Party successful. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is the Ontario Liberal Party, but I think it has, frankly, implications for the federal Liberal Party as well. We're talking with Andrew Perez, who is a Liberal Party activist. He volunteered in communications in the Central campaign during the last election. He's been involved in Ontario Liberal politics, he says, for 18 years. And he's got an interesting piece that he's published in TVO about what's wrong with the Liberal Party and what needs to change. And one of them is that we've lost, the Liberal Party has lost rural representation and involvement. My great uncle was Premier of Ontario in 1940, prior to the 40-year of Bill Davis's domination of Ontario Liberal politics and the great big blue machine and other people, not just Davis. He was the last Liberal Premier of Ontario, but he came from the United Farm Workers. Harry Nixon was his name. And then his son, my second cousin, Bob Nixon, was leader of the Liberal Party for quite a while, and then became treasurer under David Peterson. And he was a farmer, and still lives in just north of Brantford in St. George. And is very proud of the farm and had big rallies with Chrétien and Trudeau and different people at different times on the farm, and really represented that area well. When I was in university at Western Ontario, I volunteered on David Peterson's campaign, and he represented London Centre very well. And while the two Nixons were farmers and represented agricultural regions of Ontario, Peterson came from a business family, an entrepreneurial family, and a very successful one. His father ran a electronics company in London, and David Peterson was, I don't think right wing, but probably would have been described as sort of a blue liberal, fiscal conservative, even though he was progressive from a social standpoint. And he broke the conservative stronghold on premiership in government in Ontario. And then Dalton McGuinty came from this huge family in Ottawa And they were, teachers and probably more left than David Peterson, but still had a certain amount of centrism, if that's a word, to them, particularly from a social standpoint, rather than necessarily from an economic standpoint, maybe because of his Catholic roots. And also, as to your point, represented Ottawa and an area that wasn't the Greater Toronto Area. And then you talked about Sandra Pupatella. She came close to winning that leadership campaign. A lot of people thought when she was running against Kathleen Wynne, she was going to win the leadership campaign. And I was at that convention. A lot of people thought that the victory to Kathleen Wynne really was a snowstorm that kept a couple of the Sandra Pupatella buses from arriving in town to vote. And so therefore her first ballot vote was, I can't remember, but I think it was 100 and something votes less than what they had thought it was going to be. And frankly, some ex officio votes that she thought she was going to get didn't show up because of, number one, the storm, and number two, because they thought that she was going to win on the first ballot, and so forth. They didn't need to come and register anyway. So what's the lesson in my Harry Nixon, Bob Nixon, David Peterson, Dalton McGuinty, Sandra Pupatella case studies, if any?
I mean, it's hard to take firm lessons, because I think, having been around politics and I enjoy political history, so much of it is about, as you well know, cycles. David Peterson came in after a 42-year progressive conservative cycle, and obviously was immensely successful, but he definitely benefited from that, as did Dalton McGuinty, coming in after a very divisive 8-year government from Harrison Eves. The province was ready for a change, and so while Wynne did move to the left, the challenge that she faced was that she was coming in at the tail end of a 10-year government, and she was able to extend that cycle. She governed for 5 years, and credit,
she won a majority government.
And people, and that's why I don't want anybody to read my piece, and I don't think it comes off this way, to suggest that she wasn't a successful leader, because people did not think it was possible to, when she came in as leader, even had been Sandra, people thought that election was going to be a foregone conclusion for the Tories. And not only did she win another mandate, she won a majority, but she did so, again, as I say, by virtually sweeping urban Ontario. But the lessons, I think, are that leaders that are able to kind of hug the center and appeal, have broad appeal. Like, I mean, I was a toddler when David Peterson was premier, but my understanding of him is that he resonated just as effectively on Bay Street as he did in small town Ontario. And so that's the sort of leader that I think we need to look for. I'm not endorsing anybody yet. It's far too early in the process, but Jeff Lehman, mayor of Barrie, is someone that's been mayor for 12 years, and is, from my understanding, appeals to a wide spectrum of voters in that city, a small town city. And he came within a couple hundred votes of winning last month in an election, so I think.
But one of Del Duca's big problems was that he wasn't in the legislature. Would you want to make the same mistake again with voting in someone that's not in the legislature?
Yeah, and there seems to be a debate around this in the party, because people will always say, well, that it's not important that a leader be in the legislature when we're down to 7 seats. We don't even have party status. We need someone to crisscross the province, shake hands, go to every church basement and community town hall. I mean, my response to that is we need a leader who can do both. Our next leader needs to be doing both. They need to be obviously on the ground, meeting people every weekend, crisscrossing the province. But I believe strongly that they also have to be in the legislature, because I do think that Del Duca was robbed of those clips on the nightly news, even clips that are shared on Twitter and social media, because he didn't have a seat. So he couldn't hold the government to account. He wasn't able to take advantage of that. And compounded by COVID, very unfair. He became leader the week before the World Health Organization declared an international pandemic, and so his entire tenure was in a COVID environment. And so that really hurt him. And so, yeah, I think the next leader needs a seat, and they need a credible plan to get into the legislature, because with only 7 seats, we can't expect that our next leader will be a current sitting member. And so I don't know how that works. We'll see. Like, does someone step down, or do they run in a by-election that Ford ends up calling because, a member of his caucus resigns? I don't know, but I think for the next leader to wait until 2026 to run, I think would be a grave error.
Stephen Del Duca resigned on election night. He didn't even win his own riding. Second time in a row, he didn't win that riding. Most people in Ontario said they didn't know who he was. Turnout was really low, and I think one of the reasons why turnout was low is because nobody excited them. Not even, frankly, Doug Ford, and Doug Ford excited enough people to win the majority. But frankly, the Conservative absolute vote didn't go up that much at all. What happened is the turnout, generally went down to the lowest turnout in Ontario history, second lowest in Canadian history. You don't think it was just that the Ontario Liberal Party picked an uncharismatic leader that didn't resonate with people?
I don't. I think that to me, that's too simplistic of a conclusion to draw. I think that was a factor. Charismatic or uncharismatic, I think people, we've had leaders like Stephen Harper and many others that one wouldn't describe as charismatic, who've been immensely successful in Canadian history and Ontario history. So, and Bill Davis, Steve Paikin will tell you, Bill Davis in his early political career was not seen as charismatic or particularly personable. It was something that he built over a decade's career in politics. And so, yes, people weren't aware of Del Duca. I think there's, as you say, many reasons for that. COVID, and the fact that he was only leader for a couple years leading up to the election. He didn't have a seat in the legislature. People didn't know him. The timing, the cycle, the Tories had just won a mandate 4 years ago. We know in Ontario political history, it's almost unheard of for a government not to win a second mandate. The obvious one is the Bob Rae government, which was an anomaly. So, and there's a variety of factors why that was. But yes, we need an effective leader that is charismatic. But I think that's one piece of the puzzle. I think, the federal party has often suffered from this, messiah complex around, if we just select the right leader, all our problems will be solved. And I think we saw that between 2006 and 2013, when the Liberals were in opposition and went through a number of leaders, Ignatieff, Dion, Rae, and it didn't work out for different reasons. Now, Trudeau did work out as a leader with an iconic name that was able to resonate, so I wouldn't take that from him. But barring a Trudeau type figure that would come in, people are not going to know the new leader. Unless it's a household name, the new leader is going to have to introduce themselves, he or she, to Ontarians, handshake by handshake, news clip by news clip. And so, yes, let's find someone that does resonate and has some charisma. But they're not going to be a household name from the get-go. They're going to have to work incredibly hard to introduce themselves, and it's probably going to be a multi-election strategy. Hopefully, this next leader will have more than one election to prove their mettle, because I think it's going to be awfully hard to win outright in 2026.
So did Del Duca make a mistake in resigning? Should he have tried to stick it out and fight one more?
No. I think given the result, he had no choice. I think that was the right decision, and I was there in Vaughan on election night in the hall there, and his speech was personified by grace. I have nothing but positive things to say about Stephen Del Duca, having worked on that campaign, but it didn't work out for a variety of factors, and now we need to find a new leader. I would like to see a leadership contest within 2 years. We can't rush into it, but at the same time, that leader needs I would say a 2-year runway leading up to 2026. I also think we should adopt a one member, one vote system to select our new leader. I think that's the most democratic means in which to select a leader. I think it will inject new blood into the party. It will allow new people to join the party who haven't been involved in the Ontario Liberal Party. And so I'm hoping, and I said this on a radio interview last week, I'm hoping for a variety of leadership candidates. male and female from different regions of the province, and a competitive contest where all ideas are on the table. I have my points of view, but I want to hear everyone's points of view. And I think at this point in time, that's what we need. I don't think that's divisive to have a real debate, a real debate about what the future of this party is, where everything's on the table.
I think that you've raised a really interesting issue in regards to sort of the political spectrum. And I think that Justin Trudeau, our current prime minister, is an anomaly because of his name and because of his charisma. And some people, in fact, I've got another interview this week with someone who says it's not the Liberal Party anymore federally, it's the cult of Justin Trudeau. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but it's an interesting perception. But that a lot of people think that the Liberal Party federally has moved to the left, and the fact that they've joined into an agreement with the NDP is potentially a good example of that.
Right.
And yet at the same time, the Conservative Party federally is going through really, again, some people have called it an existential crisis or discussion in regards to where they're going to be positioned. And some people think Pierre Poilievre is going to take that Conservative Party to the right, that Jason Kenney and that some of the other Conservative premiers across the country have taken the Conservative Party in different parts of the country farther to the right. And that's an area that has worked in the United States, in Great Britain, and elsewhere, albeit that it may have worked that way in the past and may not be working today. But there still seem to be going that way. And the voices for a more progressive conservative or red Tory or centrist position, maybe Patrick Brown or Jean Charest would be the examples of that, don't seem to be resonating with the party that is yelling freedom at the top of their lungs, or at least parts of that party are yelling that. So there is going to be an area, both federally and potentially provincially, in the center.
Yeah.
Can you win? Can you win in the center? Can you identify in the center? Yeah. Can you excite people in the center?
Well, it's a good question, and I feel very strongly about this. I very much think you can, and we can have a semantics debate about what center, right, and left, but occupying the pragmatic center, that might be, adopting certain positions on social policy that are particularly progressive and tacking more to the center right on some economic issues. But occupying that general territory, Canadians are, whatever you want to, whatever term you want to use, they are a moderate, sensible people, especially Ontarians. But I would apply that to the whole country. Yes, we're seeing a rise in populism right now, grievance-based politics. To me, it's very sad that the federal party now is clearly. People say this is a debate. The leadership race is a debate over the soul of the party. Well, I think respectfully that debate has long ended. The party has chosen to overwhelmingly embrace grievance-based politics. That's very clear to me. That's why Pierre Poilievre will certainly win on September 10th. And so, as a centrist, as a progressive centrist, pragmatic centrist, that worries me, especially at the federal level. That we're seeing that polarization. And I reference it in my piece. When centrist parties go by the wayside, whether it's in other countries or even in the provinces, they don't tend to come back. We know that in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, once had Liberal parties that were vibrant. They may not have been in government often, but they were official opposition. They were respectable entities, and they now only exist on paper. And I have friends who come from all three provinces. So I've spoken to them about the kind of what it used to be like in those provinces where there were Liberal parties that were competitive. And so I don't want to see Ontario go in that direction whereby we have a polarization and where, we have to choose between left and right. We're already seeing that to some extent on the federal scene, to your point, because the Conservatives are certainly moving that direction and Trudeau has moved to the left. I think eventually when Trudeau moves on, there'll be an excellent opportunity for the Liberal Party to recalibrate and have a leadership debate, have a leadership contest like the provincial party is now going to have, whereby the party has a genuine debate around where we want to, what's our vision, do we want to return to our more Chrétien Martin roots? And so I think at the federal scene, at least within a Liberal context, I'm more hopeful because I think a new leader that follows Trudeau will bring a new vision that might be more centrist. And there are already prospective candidates like Sean Pan and Anita Anand who would certainly bring that perspective. At least that's the sense that I'm getting. But yeah, it's certainly a concern because for decades in this country, we alternated between Liberals and PCs, at least at the federal level, that didn't govern all that differently. The PCs were seen as a safe alternative when Liberals were seen to be corrupt or we needed a change in government. And, I'm not saying that we don't need bold new policies, but there was a consensus in this country that we weren't the US. We didn't suffer from what the Republican Party is suffering from. But that's I'm finding that starting to change here. And it does concern me more so on the federal level than the provincial level, to be honest.
We're chatting tonight with Andrew Perez, who is a Liberal activist, volunteered as head of communications during the last provincial Liberal campaign, has been involved in the Liberal Party for over 18 years and wrote a very provocative piece in TVO, posted on the TVO website about what the Liberal Party did wrong and what it needs to do differently if it's going to be successful in the future. And I think it's been an interesting piece. I'm going to ask Andrew about a different scenario after the break and see what he has to say as our concluding segment. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.
Okay, perfect.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're talking tonight about the Ontario Liberal Party and why it failed in the last election and what Andrew Perez, our guest, thinks it needs to do differently in the next couple of years to prepare for a potential victory sometime in the future. And he wrote, as I've mentioned previously, a very, very well-written and provocative piece that was posted on TVO, and I recommend it to you if you get a chance. Andrew has been involved in the Ontario Liberal Party and Federal Liberal Party for 18 years, and he was involved in the central campaign for the Ontario Liberal Party during the last election in communications. Andrew, I read your piece, and I got to tell you, I really enjoyed it. I didn't agree with all of it. I have historically been involved in the Liberal Party, and I, in the last election, was really and frankly, I was at the same convention you were at 2 years ago, and became very disillusioned with the Ontario Liberal Party, and I think it was because not this urban-rural divide that you talked about, but because I thought it had moved away from where its historical success had been and what its identity was all about historically. And I used the examples earlier of Harry Nixon, Bob Nixon, David Peterson, Dalton McGuinty, who I really think were, and Sandra Patella, frankly, who I really think were centrists. And I would describe them as fiscal conservatives and social progressives. And that, I think, has been the historical success of the Liberal Party. While the Conservative Party too often really wasn't a progressive conservative party, it was a fiscal conservative and a social conservative party. And I think one of the failings of the federal Conservative Party is that too often the social conservatives took over control. And that's one of the reasons why the federal Conservative Party had the opposite problem that you've described, is that it couldn't win in urban and suburban Canada because of Andrew Scheer and other people's social conservative roots. And while Aaron O'Toole tried to take them to the center, he was really beaten back by some of the social conservative factions within his party. Yeah. I've interviewed numerous different former progressive conservatives and federal liberals who have told me that they no longer have a party that represents them. One example I'll give you is David Crombie, who's not a close relative of mine, former mayor of Toronto, a former member of Parliament, former cabinet minister in the Brian Mulroney cabinet, ran for leader, and he said that the Progressive Conservative Party no longer exists, which it really doesn't, and the current Conservative Party left him, and he's got no home. And he doesn't feel comfortable within the Liberal Party either because it's moved to the left. So my contention is that there's a hole in the middle of the political spectrum, and that is the historic success of the federal Liberal Party and the provincial Liberal Party. The people that liked Paul Martin, who was a fiscal conservative, who balanced the budget, who was very supportive of business, both small and large, but also was a social progressive. And when was it? 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Sponsored the first national child care campaign that didn't happen. So address, if you could, this urban-rural divide that you've argued versus my issue that there's a hole in the center, that the historic success of the Liberal Party has been, and that has been vacated of late by the Kathleen Wynne budget that was more left-wing than the NDP budget, that the current platform that the Ontario Liberal Party supported was very left-wing, and that the federal Liberal Party is very left-wing.
No, I think it's all important points. I think to me, it's a bit of both. It's both the regional aspect, losing support in the regions, which is in part likely due to the left-wing lurch, but also probably just a perception that Toronto, that the party is run, so to speak, by downtown Toronto folks. So that's part ideology, part not ideology, more of a perception that, the party is not in tune with our way of life and our needs in our respective regions. But to your point, yes, I do believe substantively and perception-wise, the party has lurched to the left. There's also the issue around identity politics, if you will. I think, and Corey Tenike spoke about this, Doug Ford's campaign head of the campaign, that they were able to garner support from blue-collar folks who fiscally might be liberals. They don't believe in less government. They believe in the role of government, but on social issues are more center and are feeling that some of the identity politics that is being championed by left of center parties leaves them feeling left behind or not part of the discussion. So I think it's important for our party to continue to champion social progress. That's, I was a page in the House of Commons when Paul Martin passed the Civil Marriage Act, which legislated same-sex marriage. And so these aspects of our party's history are incredibly important. But at the same time, we can't let those who supported us in the past either not vote at all or wander off to the Conservatives or wander off to the NDP because they feel that we've lost that center, whether it's small business, entrepreneurs, to your point. And so as we look for the next leader, I'd be looking for someone that's able to bridge those divides and someone that's equally as comfortable talking, walking in and talking to a small businessman about the challenges that he faces with red tape and getting, the bottom line and that leader being just as comfortable going, visiting a farm or talking, going to rural Ontario. Or so we really need to find that person that's able to bridge that divide. And I think that's for all Kathleen Wynne and Del Duca's strengths, I think we did fall short in that area. So the leader will be an important element of rebuilding, but it will be one element. We can't simply expect the leader to solve all our problems. We need to go back to the drawing board, and especially I think as an activist at the riding association level, build strong riding associations with members that are engaged, that are willing to not get engaged a month before the election, but 2 years. We have a skeletal organization in many ridings, and that's why we had many candidates nominated days before the election, if not in the first week of the election, nominating candidates in ridings. Obviously, none of those candidates were successful, unsurprisingly. So that's another important element we didn't get too much into, but a skeletal organization whereby we have a candidate that's nominated the first week of the election.
And I guess the argument that I'm trying to make is that I think leaders are important, and potentially having someone from a rural area would be helpful. I don't think it's critical. I think organization is undoubtedly important, and I think that the local organization can add a couple percent, but it's only a couple percent to the vote. True. I think the critical factor is policies, positions, brand, and what do you stand for? And I think that the Liberal brand stood frankly for some gimmicks like $1 a ride kind of stuff and privatization of long-term care. There wasn't a substantial policy difference other than those gimmicky things, and people didn't know that the Liberal Party was in the center.
And the other point I'll just say briefly is talking about economic growth and productivity. And those are such important discussions that I haven't heard Liberals speak about eloquently, provincially and federally for years. And so to your point, like that's what made the Liberal Party one of the most successful brokerage parties in the Western world, was we had that focus. Even under McGuinty provincially, there was very much a focus on productivity and economic growth, introducing the HST. I was an intern at Queen's Park when the HST was introduced 12 years ago. It was a business-friendly tax reform. It was a gutsy public policy move, but it was a business-friendly tax reform that was necessary, that the business community was solidly behind. So let's kind of get back to some of those discussions and weave that into our platform. And I think we'll be able to speak to a larger swath of the electorate when we talk more about growth and let's build more growth. Like, yes, let's redistribute wealth so that we can equal the playing field. We all want to live in a just society, but how can we build more growth? I want to hear more of that.
Well, Andrew Perez, thank you so much for joining us. I'll end, which I think Andrew won't be surprised with, given our conclusion. I think the key is fiscal conservatism and social progressivity. And I think that area within the political spectrum is vacant today, and it's where the Liberal Party has historically been successful. I do think that Andrew's comments about prosperity and productivity and what some of the things are that Dalton McGuinty instituted, that David Peterson instituted, made a lot of sense. I think some of the things that Paul Martin and frankly Bill Morneau spoke about are probably some of the secrets to success. And I think that the Liberal Party has moved too far to the left, both federally and provincially. But I think that the federal Conservative Party is going to be moving to the right. And I think that given the current debt levels in Ontario, and the predilection of the Conservative Party and frankly Doug Ford, my sense is that the Conservative Party provincially is going to be moving to the right, and they're going to be forced to move to the right. And there's going to be a gaping hole in the middle and a huge opportunity for the Liberal Party to reinvent itself. And while clearly Justin Trudeau is the best proof that leaders can change things dramatically if they're charismatic and have a great last name, long term, what you really need is to position yourself with a brand and policies that are attractive to, if not a majority, a substantial plurality of the population. I think that's what the Liberal Party needs to do. And I look forward, Andrew, to arguing about this with you in the future. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much for the great discussion, Brian.
That's our show for tonight. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from all across Ontario, even in every rural area, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.